What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors meets a host who refuses to back down from controversy? You won't believe what unfolds when Samuel L. Jackson sits down for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview, only to find himself in the middle of a media firestorm that would leave viewers speechless and social media exploding with outrage. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two powerhouses clash in ways nobody saw coming. The atmosphere in Studio 6B was electric. As Samuel L. Jackson made his way onto Jimmy Kimmel's stage, the audience erupting in their usual enthusiastic applause. What started as a typical late-night talk show appearance quickly transformed into one of the most uncomfortable and explosive confrontations in recent television history. Jackson, promoting his latest action thriller, seemed relaxed as he settled into the guest chair, flashing his trademark smile and acknowledging the crowd with a casual wave. Jimmy Kimmel, known for his sometimes provocative interviewing style, began the segment with what appeared to be standard pleasantries. "Samuel, always great to have you back on the show," Kimmel said, his tone seemingly warm but carrying an undertone that seasoned viewers might have recognized as trouble brewing. "You've been making movies for what, 4 decades now? That's incredible longevity in this business." Jackson nodded appreciatively, clearly expecting the conversation to follow the usual promotional path. "Yeah, man, it's been a wild ride. Still loving every minute of it," he responded, his voice carrying that distinctive gravitas that has made him one of cinema's most recognizable voices. But then Kimmel's demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly, his smile becoming more calculating. "You know, I've been thinking about something lately, and I'm curious about your perspective," he began, leaning forward slightly in his chair. "There's been a lot of discussion recently about actors of your generation and how you approach certain roles, especially when it comes to language and content that might be considered controversial by today's standards." The audience, initially buzzing with anticipation, began to quiet as they sensed the conversation taking an unexpected turn. Jackson's expression remained composed, but those familiar with his work could detect a slight stiffening in his posture, a subtle shift that suggested he was suddenly on guard. "What exactly are you getting at, Jimmy?" Jackson asked, his tone still friendly but with an edge that hadn't been there moments before. The legendary actor crossed his arms, a defensive gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the studio audience or the cameras capturing every moment of this increasingly tense exchange. Kimmel pressed forward, seemingly oblivious to or deliberately ignoring the warning signs. "Well, you've used certain words in your performances over the years, words that have become incredibly divisive in our current cultural climate. Some critics have suggested that actors from your era might need to reconsider their approach to such material. Do you think there's validity to those concerns?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon, and Jackson's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His eyes narrowed, and he uncrossed his arms, placing both hands firmly on the armrests of his chair. "Hold up," he said, his voice dropping to that low, measured tone that anyone familiar with his filmography would recognize as a warning. "Are you seriously sitting here questioning my professional choices and trying to make this some kind of generational judgment call?" The studio audience began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that they were witnessing something far beyond the typical late-night banter. Kimmel, however, seemed to double down on his approach, either misreading the room entirely or deliberately pushing forward with what was clearly becoming a confrontational line of questioning. "I'm not questioning anything," Kimmel replied with a slight shrug, his tone attempting to maintain casualness while his body language suggested otherwise. "I'm just wondering if you think there might be a conversation worth having about artistic responsibility in the current landscape. You're such an influential figure, and people look up to you." Jackson leaned forward, his presence suddenly filling the space between them with an intensity that made the studio feel smaller. "Artistic responsibility," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. Man, are you kidding me right now? You brought me on this show to talk about my new movie, and instead you want to lecture me about words I've said in fictional characters? You want to make me some kind of poster child for whatever point you're trying to prove? The tension in the room was now palpable, with audience members exchanging worried glances and production staff visible in the background appearing increasingly concerned. Kimmel's usual confidence seemed to waver for a moment, but he quickly recovered, his media-trained instincts kicking in as he attempted to navigate what was rapidly becoming a public relations nightmare. "Samuel, I think you're misunderstanding my intention here," Kimmel said, his hands raised in a gesture meant to be placating but coming across as condescending. "I'm not trying to lecture anyone. I'm trying to have an honest conversation about issues that matter to people. Isn't that what good television is supposed to do?" Jackson's response was swift and cutting. "Good television? You think ambushing your guests with gotcha questions disguised as social commentary is good television? You think trying to make me defend artistic choices I made in films that were written by other people, directed by other people, and approved by studios is somehow serving your audience?" The actor's frustration was becoming more evident with each word, his hands gesturing emphatically as he spoke. The audience, caught between their loyalty to their beloved host and their obvious admiration for the legendary actor, seemed frozen in place, unsure how to react to this unprecedented display of conflict. Kimmel, perhaps realizing that his approach had backfired spectacularly, attempted to backtrack. "Look, I didn't mean to upset you. I just thought it would be an interesting discussion to have, given everything that's happening in our culture right now. You're someone whose opinion people value, and I thought our viewers might appreciate hearing your thoughts on these kinds of issues." But Jackson was having none of it. His legendary intensity, usually reserved for his most dramatic film roles, was now fully directed at his host. "My thoughts? Here's my thought, Jimmy. My thought is that you invited me here under false pretenses. You told my people this was going to be about my new film, about my career, about the things I'm passionate about. Instead, you want to turn me into some kind of cultural lightning rod for whatever agenda you're pushing this week." The confrontation was escalating beyond anything the show's producers had likely prepared for, and the cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of what was becoming a defining moment in late-night television history. Jackson's voice carried the full weight of his decades of experience in an industry that had seen him overcome countless challenges and confrontations. "You know what the real problem is here?" Jackson continued, his voice gaining momentum. "The real problem is that you think you can sit behind this desk and make judgment calls about other people's work, other people's choices, other people's art, without having walked in their shoes for even 5 minutes. You think because you've got a television show and a captive audience, you can turn serious artists into sound bites for your entertainment." The studio had become eerily quiet, with even the typically responsive audience seemingly too stunned to react. Kimmel's usual quick wit and ability to diffuse tense situations appeared to have abandoned him completely, as he faced down one of Hollywood's most formidable personalities in full confrontation mode. As the tension reached a fever pitch, it became clear that this was no ordinary celebrity interview gone slightly off track. This was shaping up to be a full-scale confrontation between two strong personalities, with Jackson's decades of professional integrity squaring off against Kimmel's determination to create compelling television content, regardless of the cost to his guests' comfort or dignity. The question hanging over the increasingly uncomfortable studio was simple. How much further would this confrontation escalate before someone decided enough was enough? The answer came swiftly and brutally as Kimmel, perhaps feeling cornered by Jackson's righteous indignation, made the catastrophic decision to double down on his position rather than retreat. "Samuel, I understand you're frustrated, but I think you're overreacting here," he said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that immediately sent shockwaves through the studio. "This is exactly the kind of defensive response that people are talking about when they discuss accountability in entertainment." The words hit Jackson like a physical blow, and the transformation in his demeanor was instantaneous and terrifying. The controlled frustration that had been simmering beneath the surface suddenly erupted into full-blown fury. "Defensive!" he roared, his voice echoing through the studio with such force that several audience members visibly flinched. "You think I'm being defensive? Man, you have completely lost your mind if you think you can sit there and tell me how to react to your ambush interview tactics." Kimmel, seemingly unable to recognize the severity of his miscalculation, pressed forward with what could only be described as professional suicide. "Look, I get that this is uncomfortable, but uncomfortable conversations are sometimes necessary. That's what journalism is about. That's what responsible media looks like in today's world." Jackson stood up abruptly, his imposing 6'2" frame towering over the seated host, creating a visual dynamic that made the power imbalance in the room crystal clear. "Journalism?" he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think this is journalism? You think what you're doing right now qualifies as responsible media? Let me tell you something about responsibility, Jimmy. Responsibility is doing your homework before you invite someone onto your show. Responsibility is treating your guests with basic human dignity and respect." The audience was now completely silent, transfixed by the spectacle unfolding before them. Many had their phones out, capturing what was clearly becoming a viral moment that would define both careers for years to come. The production crew, visible in the shadows beyond the bright stage lights, appeared to be in crisis mode, with producers frantically gesturing and whispering into their headsets. Kimmel, his face flushed and his usual composure completely shattered, made yet another disastrous choice. "Samuel, please sit down. You're making a scene, and I think we should try to handle this like professionals." The condescension in those words was the final straw. Jackson's eyes blazed with an intensity that seemed to illuminate the entire studio. "Making a scene? Making a scene?" His voice rose to a crescendo that reverberated through every corner of the building. "You brought me here under false pretenses. You ambushed me with loaded questions designed to make me look bad. You've been dismissive and disrespectful from the moment you started this line of questioning, and now you want to tell me I'm making a scene?" The veteran actor began pacing behind his chair, his movements sharp and agitated, like a caged predator finally pushed beyond his breaking point. "Let me explain something to you about scenes, Jimmy. A scene is what happens when someone with no talent, no integrity, and no respect for their craft tries to make themselves look important by tearing down people who've actually accomplished something in this business." Kimmel's face had gone pale, and beads of sweat were visible on his forehead under the hot studio lights. His usual arsenal of quick comebacks and deflecting humor seemed to have completely abandoned him in the face of Jackson's withering assault. I think there's been a misunderstanding here," he stammered, his voice noticeably shaking. "Misunderstanding?" Jackson whirled around to face him directly, his eyes locked onto Kimmel's with laser-like intensity. "The only misunderstanding here is that I mistakenly thought I was dealing with a professional. I thought I was sitting down with someone who understood the basic rules of hospitality and respect. Instead, I find myself trapped in some kind of gotcha journalism fever dream with someone who thinks controversy equals content." The actor's words were cutting through the studio air like a blade, each syllable carefully chosen for maximum impact. "You want to talk about accountability? Let's talk about your accountability as a host. You're accountable for creating a safe space for your guests. You're accountable for conducting interviews with integrity and fairness. You're accountable for treating people with the respect they've earned through decades of hard work and dedication to their craft." Kimmel attempted to interject, raising his hand weakly. "Samuel, if you could just—" "No!" Jackson's voice exploded, with such force that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the studio. "You don't get to Samuel me anymore. You lost that privilege the moment you decided to turn this interview into your personal platform for whatever social justice warrior points you're trying to score with your audience." The audience sat frozen, witnessing what was clearly the complete breakdown of the traditional host-guest dynamic that forms the foundation of all talk show entertainment. This wasn't banter gone wrong or a slight miscommunication blown out of proportion. This was a full-scale confrontation between two strong-willed individuals, with one holding all the moral authority and the other scrambling desperately to maintain some semblance of control over his own show. "You know what really gets me?" Jackson continued, his voice now carrying a dangerous quiet that was somehow more intimidating than his earlier shouting. "You sit there in your comfortable chair, in your comfortable studio, with your comfortable salary, and you think that gives you the right to put people on trial for their artistic choices. You think that makes you some kind of cultural gatekeeper who gets to decide what's acceptable and what isn't." The actor leaned forward, placing both hands on Kimmel's desk, bringing his face uncomfortably close to the host's. "But here's what you don't understand, Jimmy. Art isn't comfortable. Real art, meaningful art, challenging art. It's supposed to make people uncomfortable sometimes. It's supposed to reflect the complexities and contradictions of human experience. And if you're too small-minded to understand that, then you have no business interviewing artists." Kimmel, clearly overwhelmed and out of his depth, made one final desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "Look, maybe we should take a commercial break and reset this conversation. I think we both got a little heated, and—" Jackson's laugh was harsh and bitter, cutting through Kimmel's words like a knife. "Reset? You think this is something you can just reset? You think you can ambush someone's professional reputation and then hit the reset button when it doesn't go the way you planned?" The studio lights seemed to flicker with the intensity of the confrontation, and the audience had become so quiet that the hum of the building's air conditioning system was audible. Production assistants were visible in the background, clearly receiving urgent instructions through their headsets as the situation spiraled completely beyond anyone's control. "Here's your reset, Jimmy," Jackson said, his voice now deadly calm and measured. "The reset is that you've just shown your true colors to millions of people. You've shown them that beneath all the jokes and the celebrity friendships and the Hollywood insider act, you're just another opportunistic media personality who's willing to sacrifice other people's dignity for your own entertainment value." The words hung in the air like an executioner's blade, and it was clear that something fundamental had shifted in the room. This was no longer just a heated exchange between a host and guest. This had become a defining moment that would be analyzed, discussed, and remembered long after the studio lights dimmed and the audience went home. As Jackson straightened up and stepped back from the desk, his decision was written clearly across his face, and everyone in the studio could sense what was coming. Next, the silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, pregnant with the weight of everything that had just transpired. Jackson's eyes swept across the studio, taking in the frozen audience, the panicked production crew, and finally settling back on Kimmel, who sat slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon. When the legendary actor finally spoke, his voice carried the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. "You know what, Jimmy? I've been in this business for over 4 decades. I've worked with directors who screamed at me, producers who tried to cheat me, and studio executives who treated actors like disposable commodities. But in all that time, I've never encountered someone who invited me into their house just to disrespect me on national television." Jackson began moving toward the edge of the interview area, his movements deliberate and purposeful. "I've sat through hundreds of interviews, answered thousands of questions about my work, my life, my choices. I've dealt with tough questions, challenging questions, even inappropriate questions. But what you've done here tonight isn't journalism, it isn't entertainment, and it sure as hell isn't professional." Kimmel, sensing that his show was about to experience something unprecedented in late-night television history, made one final desperate plea. "Samuel, please, let's just talk about this. I never meant for things to go this way. Maybe I approached this wrong, but we can work through this. The audience wants to hear about your new movie. They want to celebrate your career." Jackson stopped, dead in his tracks and turned back toward the host, his expression a mixture of disgust and pity. "Work through this? You think this is something we work through? Let me make something crystal clear to you and to everyone watching at home. What happened here tonight wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was a calculated attempt to create controversy at my expense." The actor's voice began to rise again, his indignation reigniting as he continued. "You sat in production meetings and planned this. You and your writers and your producers sat around a table and decided that instead of celebrating my career or promoting my new film, you were going to try to make me the villain in whatever narrative you're trying to push. You thought you could trap me into saying something that would make headlines and boost your ratings." Jackson's accusation hit like a thunderbolt, and the reaction was immediate. Audience members began looking around at each other with dawning realization, while the production crew in the background appeared increasingly agitated. Kimmel's face had gone from pale to ashen, and his hands were visibly trembling as he gripped his interview cards. "But here's what you didn't count on," Jackson continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of his legendary screen presence. "You didn't count on the fact that I've been dealing with people like you my entire career. People who think they can use me as a stepping stone for their own ambitions. People who think my success and my reputation are somehow fair game for their entertainment." The actor began unbuttoning his suit jacket, a gesture that seemed to signal his complete rejection of the formal interview setting. "So let me tell you what's going to happen now. I'm going to walk out of here with my dignity intact and my reputation unblemished. And you're going to be left sitting there explaining to your audience why you thought it was appropriate to ambush one of your guests." Kimmel made one last pathetic attempt to salvage the situation. "Samuel, the audience loves you. They didn't want to see this happen. Can't we just reset and start over? Can't we focus on the positive?" Jackson's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Reset? Start over? Jimmy, you still don't get it, do you? There is no reset button for integrity. There's no do-over for respect. What you've done here tonight has consequences, and those consequences are that Samuel L. Jackson is done with this interview, done with this show, and done with you." The finality in his voice sent a chill through the studio. This wasn't just an angry celebrity having a momentary meltdown. This was a consummate professional making a definitive statement about standards and accountability in the entertainment industry. "I want everyone watching at home to understand something," Jackson said, now addressing the cameras directly rather than speaking to Kimmel. "This isn't about me being unable to handle criticism or tough questions. This is about basic human decency. This is about the difference between challenging someone's ideas and attacking their character. This is about the difference between journalism and exploitation." Jackson walked over to where his security detail was stationed at the edge of the set, his movement signaling that the interview was definitively over. But he wasn't finished speaking. Turning back toward the cameras one final time, he delivered what would become one of the most quoted statements in television history. "To the fans who were expecting to hear about my new movie tonight, I apologize that you didn't get that opportunity. The film is called Retribution, and it's about a man who stands up against corruption and refuses to be intimidated by people who abuse their power. I guess you got a preview of that theme right here tonight." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the studio, and a few audience members actually began to applaud, though the sound was quickly drowned out by the overwhelming tension still filling the room. Jackson looked directly at Kimmel one final time. "Jimmy, I hope you learned something tonight. I hope you learned that respect isn't something you can fake. Integrity isn't something you can manufacture. And reputation isn't something you can manipulate for your own benefit. Because at the end of the day, when all the cameras stop rolling and all the applause dies down, all you're left with is who you really are." With that devastating final statement, Jackson turned and began walking toward the studio exit, his security team falling into step beside him. The audience sat in stunned silence, many of them clearly struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Kimmel remained frozen in his chair, his mouth slightly open, his interview card scattered on the desk in front of him. As Jackson reached the edge of the stage, he paused for just a moment, not looking back, but letting his presence fill the space one final time. "And Jimmy," he called over his shoulder, "next time you want to interview Samuel L. Jackson, you better come correct, because this is what happens when you don't." The studio doors closed behind him with a definitive click that seemed to echo through the stunned silence. For several long moments, nobody moved. The audience sat frozen. Kimmel remained slumped in his chair, and the production crew stood paralyzed. In the background, the only sound was the quiet hum of the studio equipment and the distant murmur of voices from the hallway where Jackson had disappeared. Finally, Kimmel cleared his throat and looked up at the cameras, his face a mask of forced composure that fooled no one. "Well," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I guess we'll be right back after this commercial break." But everyone in that studio knew that there would be no coming back from what had just happened. Samuel L. Jackson had delivered a master class in dignity, integrity, and professional accountability, while simultaneously exposing the hollow nature of manufactured controversy. The confrontation was over, but its impact would reverberate through the entertainment industry for years to come, serving as a stark reminder that respect is earned, not assumed, and that some lines should never be crossed, no matter how high the ratings might climb.